We're going to recreate and use the full COVID data source for Florida in R. You probably have already downloaded the COVID files for Florida a number of times, but they are available from this page as well. You see, I've already downloaded them. So we're first going to create a bar chart that shows all the COVID cases by date, and then we'll show how to create a line chart from the data. So we're going to start by activating the ggplot library, and then we're going to read the two .csv files into data frames. Since they are .csv files, we don't need to activate the read Excel library, and when you do read.csv, the information comes in as a data frame, so we don't have to change the tibble into a data frame. So let's just run this. And this takes a while because, as we know, those files are large. Okay, so we have the two files read into the data frames. Now, we're going to want to combine those data frames into a larger data frame that has all of the data in it. But before we do that, we're first going to make the data frames a little simpler. You know that, for example, when we did this earlier, we kicked out a number of fields. We're going to do that here as well. The function to select certain fields from a data frame in R is subset. It has a select keyword in it. Typically what you would do is you would create a vector of the fields you want to keep. But if you put a minus in front of it, then what subset is going to do is going to keep all of the fields in the data frame except the ones that you've selected in here. So let's run this. And you see we now have a DF 2020 process with only 17 variables rather than 12 variables rather than the 17 variables. Now, as a side note, if you read the data into RStudio on a Windows machine, you may get some strange symbols in front of this object ID field. If that's the case, either delete them before you delete the columns, or alternatively, include them in front of object ID here. Okay, now, well, Python was relatively flexible when it came to combining data frames. R, like Tableau and Power BI, requires the fields in the data frames to be combined, to be lined up. They have to have the same name. And you also know that in 2020, the relevant column was called Object ID 2, whereas in 2021 it was called Object ID. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the name of Object ID in 2020 to Object ID. And you see what happens. We're going to look at all of the names in 2020. Then we're going to restrict ourselves to Object ID 2. So this will just give us Object ID 2, and we're going to set that to Object ID. Now, just as we kicked out some of the fields in the 2020 data frame, we have to do the same in the 2021 data frame. And again, we're going to do the select. You recall that 2020 never had object ID as a field, so all we need to do is get rid of age group, case 1, and chart date. So let's do that. And you see now we have two process data frames with 12 variables each. We're now going to combine those using the function rbind. So what rbind does, it simply concatenates the two data frames, the fields, the rows in the two data frames. So let's run that again. This takes a while. And now you see we have a data frame with just over 2,200,000 observations, rows. And now we're ready to start seeing if we can start creating plots. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to create a ggplot out of dfall. All I'm going to do is take x, the event date as the x, and then I'm going to try to create a bar chart. And eventually we get a funny looking chart. And the reason, of course, is the same as we had before. So if we look at dfall, the type of dfall event date, then you see it's a character. And if we print it out and we see what it looks like, dfall event date 1, then we see it's a month followed by a day followed by the year in 4 digits. Well, so we can then simply again use the sdate function. So what this is going to do, it's going to create a new column in dfall called date, which will look at the event date and then change that into a date based on this format string. So it's a month, a day, followed by a year in 4 digits. So we'll run this, and then what we can do is we can look at the let's look at what date 1 looks like. And that looks like a real date now. So now we ought to be able to create a bar chart looking at date rather than event date. So let's run this. And now we get something that looks like the bar chart we've been used to. Notice that unlike Python, I did not have to re-index the data frame. ggplot did this for me automatically. It ordered the rows, if you like, in the dfall data frame by date. Now let's see what happens when we try to create a line out of this. So what I'm going to do is ggplot dfall. Since I need a line chart, I need to specify both the x-axis and the y-axis, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to run this. And eventually we should get a funny looking line chart. And you see this doesn't look what we're looking for. And the reason is that by default, geomline shows a line from the minimum to the maximum value in a bin. So we get a line that goes from the minimum value on this date to the maximum value, and that just doesn't look right, okay? So what we can try to do is do the same trick as we did in before, when we wanted to change the way in which the bins were summarized in a bar chart. So we could try to do something like this, right? Remember, so we did stat summary bin fun equals count, but that's not going to work because geomline does not have the stat parameter. So what we're going to have to do is do something slightly different. So what does support is a large number of stat functions, and these stat functions are essentially ways in which you can summarize the bins, which in this case is object ID. So what we're going to want to do is stat count, and then we're going to want to say that the way in we want to show that is as a line. All right, so let's run this. Okay, and then what we need to do is make sure that we only use a single, only the X static. So we'll run that now. And then eventually we'll see the line chart appear. So it's a bit complicated in the sense that some of the geoms, like geom bar, allow you to change the function that is used to summarize the bins. Others, like geom line, do not. And what you need to do in the case of geom line is to not use geom line, but in fact use a stat function, and then within that stat function specify that the visualization you want to use is a line chart.